Hello, everyone. Welcome to another video on the History of podcast. And today I'm joined by Dr. Travis Proctor. And today we'll be discussing his upcoming course for the Bar Armin Professional Services titled Demons and Ghosts in the Bible. The link to purchase the course will be in the description below and in the pinned comment. So, Travis, thank you for joining me today.
Yeah, Jacob, thanks for having me. Excited to have this conversation with you.
Thank you for joining me. Can you tell us how many lectures will be contained in the course and what aspects of the origins of evil is it going to cover?
Yeah, so it's a 26 lecture class, and it's going to be covering everything from origins of demons and how they function in the Bible, where they show up in stories in the Bible, but also the same thing for ghosts, as well as related figures like fallen angels, as well as Satan. So looking where they come from, what are some ancient contexts that we see them outside of the Bible, then also where these figures show up in the Bible and kind of what role are they playing in these biblical texts, so that we can learn a little bit about biblical stories here, but also about broader contexts that have shaped them.
What are the demons and ghosts in biblical texts, and where do they come from?
Yeah, so for demons, we have a kind of a clear backstory on that, at least depending on the text. I think we have demonic beings showing up in Old Testament or Hebrew Bible texts, although that term isn't quite used. Demon is actually a Greek term that we see start being used by the time we get around to, say, the New Testament by Greek-speaking Jews. In the Old Testament, we have figures that show up that seem like demonic beings, but aren't quite called that term. And we don't really know where they come from. They don't give us a good backstory, but they seem to be, we have these evil creatures that will show up in various biblical passages, for example. And in the New Testament, we do have demons show up using that Greek terminology, daimon. Sometimes they're called impure spirits. Again, the New Testament and, say, gospel stories don't really tell us where they come from, although, again, we can fill in some of those gaps using some knowledge that we have of kind of background context. So we know that, for example, most ancient Jews, and it was Jewish writers writing these texts in the New Testament, often believed that demons came from primordial kind of residue of giants who were born from the union of fallen angels and mortal women. So we have a famous story from Genesis 6, right before Noah's flood, where the sons of God have these relations with the daughters of men and seemingly create these Nephilim. Well, and this story is kind of enigmatic. We don't get a lot of context for what all these things mean. But then outside the Bible, we have texts like First Enoch. This portion of the text is called the Book of the Watchers, that explain this story a little bit more fully. And what it explains is that fallen angels kind of desired mortal women. They had relations with them and married them, and their offspring were these giants who created all this havoc. And it seems like most ancient Jews believed that demons were actually the souls of those giants who actually perished in the flood of Noah. Now, the New Testament text that we have never explicitly say this, but that does seem to be the background behind some of these things. So it's where these demons come from. As for ghosts, again, we don't really get an origin story for ghosts, but we can fill in some of the gaps from ancient context. Stretches back very far in human history that humans have told stories about spirits of deceased people lingering on, and even the reasons why they linger on are oftentimes similar to our own. Like maybe they've died before their time, or they've experienced a really tragic death or a really violent death, perhaps, and they linger on because they have kind of unfinished business. That's probably the background for most biblical ghost stories. The ones that are really famous that we see show up, for example, are the prophet Samuel. His ghost is called by the king, by the so-called Witch of Endor. And his ghost is actually kind of comes back to help advise the Jewish king of the time. And so that's one story that we see where we see ghosts show up. Another one is actually where we see stories of the resurrection of Jesus, where it seems like some of the followers of Jesus kind of misperceive him to be a ghost, or misperceive who he is, perhaps because they're seeing some type of ghost-like entity here. Or other parts of the story are likely meant to confirm to his followers who are seeing that he is not a ghost. And so when Jesus says, see my hands and my feet, or touch me and see that I'm not, just like a spirit being, like a ghost. Most likely the earliest readers would have kind of seen these as like early ghost stories. So we don't really get a good sense of where these beings come from or anything like that, but we can fill in some of those gaps by looking at broader contexts.
Where did the idea of Satan come from?
Yeah, a great question. And that's one where maybe surprisingly, the idea of Satan isn't in places where you'd expect it to be. So I'll start there. For example, we oftentimes think of Satan being in the Garden of Eden, the serpent who tempts Adam and Eve. However, if you read the original Hebrew and the original version of that text in Genesis, this is actually just a serpent, a tricky talking serpent, so it is an odd serpent, but it never says that the serpent is inhabited by a spirit, or it never identifies this serpent as Satan or the devil or anything like that. And this is generally true of the Hebrew Bible, that the idea of Satan actually doesn't really show up all that much, as much as you might think it would, based on how popular kind of the idea of Satan is today. And where we do see it start to show up, it's in a different way than how we find in, say, later Christian culture and even later Jewish cultures. So, for example, one of the most important texts where Satan shows up is in the book of Job, where it said this figure, the Satan, kind of accuses Job of being a righteous man only because he's so blessed with earthly goods and happiness. And he kind of accuses Job before God, and then God then allows the Satan, it says, to then take away everything from Job. And that kicks off the story of Job's suffering, and that text exploration of the cause of evil and things like that. But what's important is that if you read this text closely, it's clear that the Satan isn't some type of chief demon figure or some kind of evil leader of demons or anything like that, but instead is kind of a member of God's court. And that term, the Satan, really just means the adversary. And so one way I explain this is that the Satan here seems to be playing the role of kind of like the prosecutor in God's divine court. That is, the person whose job it is to kind of accuse people of certain things and kind of prosecute their case, and then kind of see how things shake out, see if they're able to defend themselves or make the case that they actually are righteous. And that's kind of what he does with Job. We do start to see in the Hebrew Bible an idea develop that there is some type of kind of chief evil figure that is opposing God in some way. And we do a couple of times in like First Chronicles see this word Satan used for seemingly like an evil figure of some sort that's opposing God. But we really have to look outside the Bible to see its full development. And what we see is that in Second Temple Judaism, in kind of non-canonical, non-biblical texts, although some of these texts would have been read quite frequently by ancient Jews, we see there develop an idea that kind of opposed to God, there is a chief demon figure who is wholly evil, sometimes identified as a kind of fallen angel who is opposing God and also trying to corrupt humanity. What's interesting, though, is that when we see these figures show up, they don't always have the name Satan. Sometimes they have other names like Azazel, for example. And we see that too also in the New Testament Gospels, where we see a reference to Beelzebub, for example. But what we do see is that probably by the time that we get into kind of later Second Temple Judaism and also into the Jesus movement, when Jesus comes around, there does seem to be a pretty developed Jewish idea that there's a figure, an evil figure who opposes God, and they are using that word Satan to refer to him. And then we see it show up in the Gospels too. So these are early Jewish texts that later become, part of the Christian tradition. And they seem to have this idea that there's some kind of chief evil figure that is Satan. So I would say it's has its origins in biblical and non-biblical Jewish text, takes some time to develop. By the time we get to early Christianity, we really start to see a full-fledged idea of Satan as a kind of chief demon figure. And then it kind of takes on a life of its own from there.
What role did the fallen angels play in the origin of evil?
Yeah, according to many ancient Jewish and early Christian writers, they played a really big role. So I think a lot of common Christian understandings today, again, would go to that story of Adam and Eve for the origins of evil. And of course, that is a very prominent story in Jewish and Christian tradition, where you have the serpent tempting Adam and Eve, and that's kind of where evil enters the world. However, we have lots of ancient Jews and ancient Christians that cite other stories when they're trying to explain, and fallen angels play big roles there. And so that's where I cited that Genesis 6 tradition, ideas of the sons of God and daughters of men. Many readers understood sons of God to be a reference to kind of angel figures, and therefore, when they fall, when they come down, they're fallen angels. And as I said before, in texts like First Enoch and in the Book of the Watchers, we have a full-fledged version of fallen angels falling to the earth. And these stories really provide, interesting and really fleshed out explanations for the origins of evil. They say, this is how evil entered into the world, or at least maybe came to, if it's already entered the world thanks to Adam and Eve, at least it's come to its full fruition, where people start to learn things that they weren't supposed to learn, maybe how to do things like magic. Or some writers will say this is where the first knowledge of making war instruments, weapons of war first happened, was because of fallen angels sharing knowledge about how to work metals, for example. And so in these texts, we can see a real development of the idea of fallen angels being key figures. And in fact, when you read some ancient and Jewish Christian authors, it's really that story, the story of fallen angels, that serves as the main explanation for why evil came into the world, or how evil came into the world. And Adam and Eve, it plays a role sometimes, but actually maybe not as big of a role as you might think. So for many ancient Jews and Christians, I think fallen angels were actually kind of the main explanation for how evil came into the world.
What is the connection between demons and magic and spirits in ancient cultures?
Yeah, that's a great question, and we see quite a few of them. And I think there's kind of two sides to this question. On the one hand, we have lots of evidence that demons were sometimes invoked as helpers in magic. On the other hand, we sometimes see magic being used as a way to thwart demons. And this likely goes back to the fact that in ancient cultures, demon or daimon, if you're reading in Greek and Latin, actually has two real senses. Outside of Jewish and Christian cultures, among like Greco-Roman writers, for example, those Greek and Latin terms could be used to refer to really any kind of divine or semi-divine spirit. So famously, the philosopher Socrates in Plato's Apology uses daimon to refer to kind of an inner spirit that's helping to guide him as he's making decisions. But clearly, he doesn't mean like evil demon. He means like kind of some kind of benevolent spirit that's helping him out. And we see that among other Greco-Roman writers as well, using that term in a more neutral or even benevolent sense. In that sense, it looks like there were ancient magical traditions where magical rituals or magical practitioners would think that these kind of benevolent or neutral daimons could help them out with magic. And so part of the magical ritual would be to kind of say what we'd think of as a prayer or make a kind of sacrifice to then summon a demonic assistant. And then that demonic assistant would carry out or help you out with whatever magical thing you were trying to do, whether it was healing somebody, or maybe it was a love spell or something like that, maybe wishing, ill upon an enemy. We have lots of evidence for those kinds of magical spells. So that'd be one way that daimons played an important role as a more neutral or helpful kind of entity. But then we also see them play a more negative role in magical spells, which is in Jewish and Christian cultures, that word daimon comes to be used for totally evil figures, usually working against God and usually trying to oppress the followers of God in some way, oftentimes by taking control of their bodies, demonic possession. And what we see is that that we have many magical rituals that function like exorcisms. They're meant to thwart the presence of the demonic, or if somebody's already possessed, to get rid of that demon from them. And this goes to show that there's kind of a broader religious/magical landscape where one thing that people are really worried about in the ancient world are these demons possessing them. And sometimes they would go to either religious figures or magical practitioners, if you will, to try to get help with these. And so for that reason, we see them show up in magical text and rituals as well.
When do we start seeing the idea that Satan is launching a war against God, trying to overthrow him? Where do we start
Yeah.
seeing stories like that?
Yeah, good question. I think those come mostly, we start to see hints of that in Second Temple Judaism. The earliest explanations for why angels fell usually had to do with some kind of temptation. That is, they were tempted to earth. It's usually some kind of erotic temptation that these fallen angels were kind of looking too closely on mortal women and fell to the earth. That's usually at the start, in our earliest stories of fallen angels, that's what we see. But then we do start to get an idea that Satan, as a kind of fallen angel, chief demon figure, is opposing God. He's one of these fallen angel figures, but that he's also at the head of a kind of demonic or fallen angelic army. And I think we see that about the same time we see just the figure of Satan emerge in general in late Second Temple Judaism and early Christianity. The book of Revelation is one of our really good examples of that, and probably the most famous, where we see Satan depicted as kind of a military commander or at the head of a kind of army that's opposing God in that way. And so I think it goes hand in hand with the development in ancient Judaism and then early Christianity of apocalyptic ideas. The idea that kind of God's final righteousness and final justice, and also God's final kingdom, let's say, is going to come to fruition through an apocalyptic moment where this world is going to end very suddenly. The forces of good are going to take on and defeat the forces of evil, and then there will be, a kingdom restored, a kind of utopia on Earth or maybe elsewhere. those ideas become really popular in ancient Judaism and early Christianity. And that really shapes the idea of Satan being a kind of military figure, a fallen angel who is leading these forces. So I'd place it somewhere in there where we start to see those ideas emerge.
And and when the book of Revelation was written and it talks about these things, what kind of changes does it make to the narrative, or does it keep it largely the same?
Yeah, good question. I think Book of Revelation certainly carries on many things that we see happening in ancient Jewish thought of the day. Many scholars have pointed out there are strong connections between the Book of Revelation and ideas of ideas that we already find in what we would call apocalyptic Judaism. And so the idea that there's going to be a Messiah figure who comes back and restores God's kingdom, that was a very common Jewish apocalyptic idea. The idea that there'd be some kind of final battle between forces of good and evil, that's a very common Jewish idea we find in the Dead Sea Scrolls, for example, which date before the time of the Book of Revelation. And again, the idea that there'd be some kind of chief demon, Satan-like figure playing a role in that, again, we definitely find that in ancient Jewish traditions. I think where we see the major changes to that are, of course, the special role of Christ, of Jesus playing a role in this. We'd expect that in a text from the Jesus movement, him serving as the Messiah, and some ideas of, and the other idea would be the historical context really shapes Revelation in the sense that it shapes its prophecies to fit its context, which is, the main kind of evil on earth in the view of John, who's producing these prophecies, is the Roman Empire. And so we could see those prophecies kind of being melded or fit to the historical context where that expectation of forces of evil opposing forces of good takes on a very Roman hue. And so that's where we could see, figures who are predicted or who show up as oftentimes these kind of fantastical beasts, for example. Many scholars have pointed out that these correlate very well to successions of Roman emperors. Nero famously seems to be the reference that we have with the mark of the beast or the number 666, for example. Many scholars find that to be that identification to be the most likely. And so that's where I think it takes those already common ancient Jewish ideas, but does reshape them to fit its own context.
How do biblical ghost stories reflect ancient views on spirits and hauntings?
Yeah, good question. I think they reflect them in a few different ways. One, I think just the basic idea that it's possible that spirits of the deceased could enter into the land of the living, and so it was very common in the ancient world, and including in many biblical texts, that everyone who passed away had a common landing spot, if you will. In Greco-Roman tradition, that's called Hades, but in the biblical tradition, that's called Sheol. And the idea was that there was a general place of the dead where, well, pretty much everyone went, whether you're good, bad, or somewhere in between. But it was often thought that when you went there, you weren't quite your former self. You didn't have your flesh and blood body anymore. You were kind of quite literally a shade of your former self, a kind of ghost-like entity. And that's where we get this foundation of, well, if entities are still existing, but they're just in this other place, Sheol or Hades, is there a possibility that maybe they could re-enter this kind of regular land of the living? And we at least have some hints from biblical stories that at least some ancient Israelites or Jews held that to be a possibility. And then the resurrection stories of Jesus, kind of show that awareness of, Greco-Roman storytelling and ancient Jewish storytelling about ghosts as well, that it's a possibility at least that ghosts might enter into this. I think the other thing where we see it reflected are the potential uses or involvement of ghosts or the deceased in magic. And so it was a common understanding in the ancient world that those who had passed on might have some special abilities because at that point they've entered into the underworld or maybe some other afterlife place. And maybe that means they have a kind of special knowledge or maybe a special connection to the divine. So we have lots of magical rituals that use the deceased, either spirits of the deceased, aka ghosts, or maybe even sometimes like the remains of the deceased, so-called necromancy, using the kind of remains of the deceased for some kind of magical ritual. And we see that show up in the story of Samuel and the Witch of Endor. When the so-called Witch of Endor, this is in the book of 1 Samuel, summons Samuel, she's doing something, and this is kind of the role of a medium. That is somebody who's serving as a conduit between the land of the living and other realms, out there, including the land of the deceased and ghosts. And so that was a very common idea in the ancient world. And this story in First Samuel is I think, reflecting that bigger context. One other area that I note, again, with stories of the resurrection appearances with Jesus, again, likely reflects broader ideas about ghosts, in the sense of ideas about ghosts where that, you didn't still have your flesh and blood body. You were some type of like spirit entity that, people would pass through, or you wouldn't quite have the solidity that you'd have in your regular life. Well, we can of course see this whenever Jesus is denying that he's a ghost. He's saying, "Hey, touch me, see that I'm really here, or see my hands and my feet." There were some ancient traditions that ghosts didn't have, say, feet, for example. They would just kind of float along. And so when Jesus says, "Hey, see my feet, touch me, see, touch my wounds," the famous doubting Thomas story, for example, that's really confirming that he's not a ghost. And so that's where people who were familiar with ancient ghost stories, and then they read the resurrection accounts, that light bulb would go off, like, oh, this story just confirmed that those traditions of Jesus's resurrection, they were not about, they were not ghost stories. This was something else going on here. So I think that's another area where we can see ancient ideas about ghosts really influencing biblical storytelling.
So you think the story about those details about Jesus saying, "Look, like his feet, look at this, look at that part of my body," is to counter and distinguish himself, or the writers doing that at least, from ghosts. Say Jesus is better here. He's different. He's not like them.
Yeah, I think so. And I think part of the context for that might have been what we'd call a kind of apologetic context, defending, those claims. Because you can imagine when we think early followers of Jesus started claiming Jesus was resurrected, pretty early on, and that's kind of where we get the origins of Christianity. You can imagine how other ancient people would have reacted. And we kind of have some hints. They most likely would have said, "Oh, you were just seeing things," or, "Hey, you maybe just saw a ghost." We know that critics of Christianity said, "Oh, his body was just stolen. You didn't really, he wasn't really resurrected." So it's likely that these texts are, one function they're serving is a kind of apologetic function. They're defending against claims that are being, levied against Christians. And yes, that would be one of them, is saying, okay, if you want to claim that this was just a ghost that we saw and it wasn't really Jesus kind of in the flesh, so to speak, the story kind of confirms that, is attempting to say, "Hey, this isn't really a ghost here. This is something more than that."
What do you think caused Satan to develop into into such a major antagonist and the opponent of God?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think, the bigger picture religious changes that are happening, I think, are in part due to, the development of apocalypticism in ancient Judaism. That as we get into the later parts of Second Temple Judaism, so say like the second and first century BCE, we see some really robust ideas, Jewish writings that are saying that an apocalypse is coming, the end of the world, and God's going to restore everything and restore his righteous Israel to its rightful spot in the Holy Land. And I think that as those stories developed, what many scholars have noted for a long time is that apocalyptic storytelling and apocalyptic ideas are very dualistic. They oftentimes have a very kind of black and white understanding of good versus evil, and there's not a lot of gray area. In apocalyptic writing, there's no kind of moral ambiguity. There's no morally ambiguous characters. You're either on the good side, the righteous, or you're on the evil side. So for an apocalyptic system to really work, you of course have God and oftentimes his helpers, maybe a Messiah, that are serving on the behalf of the side of the righteous. But then you need kind of someone to oppose him. And that's really where I think scholars would place, like, why do we see the emergence of the Satan figure? Well, in an apocalyptic system, you kind of need a Satan-like figure to emerge. Now, I think then, of course, Satan becomes a fascinating figure, because then as a fallen angel, people are really interested in, why would a figure who's in heaven, rebel against God? And I think we see various explanations. We see early explanations with fallen angels, including Satan, seem to be focused on more like erotic temptation. But then we do start to see some ideas show up where this had more to do with, say, the pride of this fallen angel, that they were, in the heavenly court, but maybe they aspired to be on par with God. And since they couldn't be that, they rebelled against God. And we see those ideas develop certainly in early Christianity, and that becomes a major explanation. We actually see it influence later religious traditions too, like Islam. We find that rationale in the Quran for its satanic figure, Iblis, for example. So there are various explanations given, but I think the bigger development that leads to Satan being this key antagonist is, I think, that development of a really robust sense of Jewish apocalypticism.
And then my final question, when do you see, what is the earliest layer that is detectable that we start seeing the beginning of the development of evil as it's understood in Judaism?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think we see a sense of, I think the earliest sense we might get, or maybe some of the earliest stories that we can trace, would probably be those Genesis 6 stories of the sons of God and daughters of men and the Nephilim, and this idea that evil really enters the earth right before the flood of Noah. And of course, again, I think we oftentimes maybe want to trace that back to the Adam and Eve story. We get a sense that, there is a fallenness there, of course, but at least when you're reading the Genesis narrative through after that, Genesis 6 really seems to be this turning point. And we do think that Genesis 6 seems to be an ancient story that goes back. It's probably among the earlier biblical stories. So we do get a sense that ancient Israelite religion and ancient Jewish tradition did have some kind of sense of kind of evil and fallenness, probably back to its really earliest origins. Even if it didn't have maybe a Satan figure early on, it did have a sense of kind of forces opposing God, or a kind of a sense of evil among humanity, existing in those earlier eras. So I do think that's something we could trace back to pretty early parts of Israelite or Jewish religion.
As I let everybody know about demons and ghosts in the Bible, the link to purchase the course will be in the description below and in the pinned comment. And that being said, thank you very much for joining me today, Travis Proctor.
Yeah, thank you. Really appreciate you having me.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.